This is the Morning Press, a brainiron.com production. Here's 11 minutes or so of news for today, Monday, March 4th, 2024. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled Monday that former President Donald Trump will remain on Colorado's presidential primary ballot, overturning the Colorado Supreme Court decision that declared Trump ineligible under Section 3, the Insurrection Clause, of the 14th Amendment. The ruling was unanimous, with all 9 justices agreeing that Colorado, along with all the other states, lacks the authority to declare a federal office seeker ineligible. As Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson wrote in a concurrence, quote, "The Reconstruction Amendments were specifically designed as an expansion of federal power and an intrusion on state sovereignty. Section 3 marked the first time the Constitution placed substantive limits on a state's authority to choose its own officials. Given that context, it would defy logic for Section 3 to give states new powers to determine who may hold the presidency." End quote. Though they concurred in the judgment, the court's 3 liberals and Justice Barrett, who wrote separately, further believe that the majority went too far in its claim that Congress must take legislative action to enforce Section 3. Again from the concurrence, quote, "The majority resolves much more than the case before us. Although federal enforcement of Section 3 is in no way at issue, the majority announces novel rules for how that enforcement must operate. It reaches out to decide Section 3 questions not before us, and to foreclose future efforts to disqualify a presidential candidate under that provision. In a sensitive case crying out for judicial restraint, it abandons that course." End quote. The majority issues the key line of the decision, and one that should invalidate all further efforts to bar Trump from ballots at the state level under the 14th Amendment, as has happened in Maine and Illinois, and will likely halt challenges in several other states still making their way through the courts. Quote, "For the reasons given, responsibility for enforcing Section 3 against federal office holders and candidates rests with Congress and not the states." End quote. A brief editorial aside. This unanimous decision by the court is a relief. It is plainly the case that states cannot be permitted to decide, one by one, that a person is an insurrectionist ineligible to hold federal office, and that such a decision must be made instead by a federal authority. All 9 justices agree. The 14th Amendment was a check on state power, a claiming of authority by the federal government, not intended as the reverse. The majority takes things a step further, insisting that congressional legislative action would be required to bar a candidate under the 14th Amendment, while the 3 liberals would prefer that the court not attempt to, quote, "use this case to define the limits of federal enforcement of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment." End quote. I am persuaded that the majority is saying more than is strictly necessary here, and it would have been to my preference that they had narrowed their decision so as to avoid the appearance of disagreement at all. As Justice Barrett writes in her own concurrence, quote, "The court has settled a politically charged issue in the volatile season of a presidential election. Particularly in this circumstance, writings on the court should turn the national temperature down, not up. For present purposes, our differences are far less important than our unanimity. All 9 justices agree on the outcome of this case. That is the message Americans should take home." End quote. Instead, the majority, in attempting to define precisely how Section 3 must be enforced, all but demands a response from the liberals, who correctly feel compelled to note the perceived overreach. It's not a huge deal, but it does point to the limits of the court's willingness to say as little as possible in order to speak with one authoritative voice, and probably signals that the presidential immunity question, on which they will hear arguments in April and decide this summer, is going to be similarly muddled by unnecessary disagreement about ancillary questions. I still have hopes for another 9-0 ruling on Trump's immunity claims, but almost certainly with some rather fraught and argumentative concurrences. There will be anti-Trump partisans who try to make this whole thing out to be some sort of illegitimate miscarriage of justice. But this was always a bad way to try to take him out, and one that spoke right to the heart of his and his supporters' victimization and persecution narratives. I'll take the unanimity of the Supremes over the outrage of the op-ed pages any day. In briefer political news, Nikki Haley on Sunday won the Republican primary in Washington, D.C., denying Trump a sweep of every contest, at least, even as the victory was derided by the Trump campaign as indicative of the only support she enjoys, namely, the support of, quote, lobbyists and D.C. insiders that want to protect the failed status quo, end quote. Trump won the Idaho, Michigan, and Missouri caucuses on Saturday, collecting a total of 134 delegates to Haley's 4 in those 3 states. The North Dakota caucus is taking place today, and 15 states vote tomorrow, including California, Texas, and Virginia, in Super Tuesday contests that will likely see Trump pile up an overwhelming share of the available delegates. And the estate of Sinead O'Connor has asked the Trump campaign to refrain from using the late singer's songs at campaign events after her hit Nothing Compares to You was played before his CPAC speech last weekend. The estate issued a statement that said, quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that Sinead would have been disgusted, hurt, and insulted to have her work misrepresented in this way by someone who she herself referred to as a biblical devil. As the guardians of her legacy, we demand that Donald Trump and his associates desist from using her music immediately." End quote. A brief editorial aside. Trump's inevitable march to the nomination is continuing as expected, with Haley's ongoing presence, and even her win in D.C., only serving to highlight his dominance. The bulk of the contests on Tuesday award their delegates in winner-take-all fashion, meaning that Trump will only need to secure just over 50% of the votes to pile up big numbers. This is by design. The GOP favors an early consensus from the base rather than a drawn-out process that might allow candidates to seem viable into the spring. Combine that with today's Supreme Court decision and the New York Times Siena poll over the weekend that showed Trump with a 5-point lead over President Biden if the election were held today. And you've got some rather strong tailwinds for Trump's electoral prospects. The poll further claims that 47% of Americans strongly disapprove of Biden's handling of his job, a new high. All this while senior Biden campaign officials are telling The New Yorker that they believe they will win the election by focusing almost exclusively on Donald Trump as a threat to democracy and the election as a fight for the soul of the nation. It makes sense that the Biden campaign would lean into these abstractions rather than point to their record, because seemingly, no matter what they say, people seem to continue to believe that their economic circumstances and prospects were better before Biden took office. The problem with this line of thinking is that the only truly rabidly motivated constituency in the 2024 electorate is already the anti-Trump vote. And it's not clear to me that there are any voters to be gained by fanning those flames. I still don't see a path to the presidency for Trump. How could we possibly decide to do this to ourselves again? But if one exists for Biden, I think it has to include an affirmative message about his own record and a vision of the next 4 years that contains more substance than merely holding Trump at bay. The average potential swayable voter will simply not be moved to Biden's side out of some desire to protect democracy. I think there is limited purchase for the idea that voting in someone, even an authoritarian, is anything but democracy in action. As for Sinead O'Connor's music at Trump rallies, it continues to be a source of immense amusement, the pop cultural waters Trump swims in. Of course he's using that haunting and beautiful love song as a way to jokingly refer to himself, as a bizarre signal of his audience's unflagging adoration for him and what they believe he represents. The idea that the lived artistic output of the artist is in complete contradictory opposition to everything Trump stands for is as obviously true as it is completely beside the point, and is the price of doing art in public, for public consumption, to be ingested and digested and expelled out the back end in only the basest manner, as only the lowest common denominator can. As I have written before, once the art gets into the public, the artist doesn't get to dictate the totality of its meaning. It is both high and low, yours and theirs. Respect for Sinead's artistic integrity dictates precisely the sort of statement her estate issued, and total disrespect for anything like a claim of artistic integrity is probably in some ways essential to Trump's appeal. What are you going to do? For now, I guess we can all continue to evince astonishment and offense at the very fact of Trump's prominence, and simply hope that abstract moral injury carries the day, as the Biden campaign seems to hope it will. I'm not so sure. Now, here's a look at the weather. Apologies for no morning press Thursday or Friday last week, as I was feeling under the weather, so to speak, and could not properly focus the mind. The Wednesday episode was also rather heavy, with an extended commentary on the uselessness of self-immolation as political protest, and I felt temporarily incapable of following that up, because that was a good and difficult essay. The only thing to do when confronted with the fact that one is not going to meet one's own expectations about quality, in my experience, is to go in the exact opposite direction, which is my way of setting up the following brief response to a nonsense TikTok trend. The Washington Post reports that some viral videos on TikTok are convincing flyers to buckle their feet inside their airplane seatbelt in order to have a more comfortable flight. The headline is as follows, quote, "TikTok's seatbelt hack for airplane sleep is a recipe for disaster. Don't buckle your feet in a seatbelt no matter what TikTok tells you." End quote. Apparently, people are bending their knees up to their chests and then buckling their seatbelt across their ankles rather than their hips and laps, and this is making them more comfortable and relaxed. This qualifies as a trend, I suppose, because the various videos have been viewed a sufficient number of times to warrant a concerned article about them in the Post, which of course only amplifies their reach, but whatever. Obviously, the headline does all the work. One should not wear the seatbelt in a way that it was not intended to be worn, because it's probably dangerous and against various rules and regulations, and very obviously stupid. But the Post, like every other journalistic outlet, is pathologically obsessed with consulting the experts. Thus, in the 7th sentence of the story, we are treated to the experts say line, which in this case goes like this. Quote, "Experts say the hack can put travelers in danger. In addition to the potential for severe cramping, wearing your seatbelt incorrectly means you may be less mobile in the event of an emergency. You could also be thrown from your seat in the event of severe turbulence, a risk that's increasingly common." End quote. At least they restrained themselves from the further parenthetical aside. We were spared the "experts say severe turbulence is increasingly common because of climate change," though they did link to a piece that makes that precise claim. But thank God the author of this piece consulted with the relevant authorities on how improper seatbelt wearing is bad. If not, we would be left to rely on the assurances of the writer herself that it is dangerous and stupid to strap your feet into the seatbelt instead of your gut. But for this expert, specifically trained in the mysterious and impenetrable seatbelt arts, the public might still be in danger. This is probably not a very big deal, obviously, but I think it's possible that an over-reliance on so-called expertise has a cumulative effect of making actual experts seem extraneous and unnecessary and kind of fake. When journalists have to appeal to the authority of the expert class to get you to wear your airplane seatbelt properly, or to eat your fresh vegetables, or to go for a walk after dinner, it just comes off as a bunch of nagging and haranguing about things you already know. Save the experts for the questions that expertise actually informs, and only when it actually matters. Nuclear proliferation, or vaccine efficacy, or international diplomatic relations. Experts say loses all of its power when it's deployed to insist that 2 and 2 make 4, and makes it less likely that the experts will be heeded when their input is needed most. That's the weather from here. How's it look out your window? The Morning Press is a production of the BrainIron.com multinational media empire. Please direct comments and complaints to brainironpodcast@gmail.com. For a transcript of today's episode and links to the stories referenced, find The Morning Press at brainiron.substack.com, where, if you would like to support this and the other podcasting and blogging endeavors of the BrainIron.com media empire, you can also become a paying subscriber. If you can think of anyone else who might enjoy whatever it is we're up to around here, please consider sharing. Thanks, and barring the sudden onset of the inevitable, we'll talk to you tomorrow.
The proceeding was created with 100% human content.